You know, I don't want my students at Hartbury to be replicates of me. You know, I'm not perfect. You know, there's lots of flaws in the way I do things. But what I'd like is for my students to make their decisions. I'd like owners to make their decisions based on the evidence and follow that as their guide. When you look at those sort of formatted rehabilitation plans, it will be week 1, week 2, week 3. And I fundamentally believe that that is our wrong approach. We should be using milestones, not time frames, when it comes to judging whether to move on. I don't think it's as easy as saying horses should never be on box rest.
Happy Wednesday, everybody. How you doing, Rhi?
I'm good. I'm excited for this one. This one's been like one of the ones that's been waiting in the wings for me. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm all right. I'm kind of teetering on the edge of crippling anxiety. But I'm starting to really... No, it's not funny, but if you don't laugh, you cry. So I'm really starting to understand that this is more exhaustion and depletion than anything that's actually wrong. So basically my anxiety kind of convinces me that like all sorts of things are going to happen or not happen or whatever, and that I have like major things to ruminate on. And the reality of that is actually all of those things are not something I need to concern myself with. I am just at the bottom of the barrel looking up. And yeah, like I went to a wedding at the weekend.
Yeah.
And I actually went to Legoland the day before with my nephew, and I'm going to describe it like kind of like they could use it as a torture. Yeah, they could. we had a lovely time in some ways, but there was music, this awful music playing. Like like if you were to play a computer game like Mario Kart, for example.
Yes, okay.
Like that sort of music playing in every area, even the toilets. Not joking. And like it was terrible. It was really, really overstimulating. And there was a bit at the end, and you're like walking up the ramp out of the place, right? I've got a nephew. He's 4 years old, by the way. I didn't just go to Legoland for the fun of it, because nobody would do that unless they were completely clinically mental. But you're like going up this ramp to the end, and then at one point it actually becomes like a real life game of snakes and ladders, because all of these parents are trying to leave with their children, and then at the last hurdle, literally like 200 yards from the gift shop, there's just a load of slides that take the children halfway back down the ramp. And I'm like, who did that? It was like, you can imagine it being like, come on, Peter, time to go home. Zzz, back down the slide. Okay, back we go, up the hill. Zzz, back. You'd never leave. It's like a endless infinity cycle of hell. So we did that on the Friday, anyway, for my nephew's birthday. And then we had a wedding on the Saturday. And I was like, wow, this is going to be a lot for the old... Oh, thankfully not. It was incredible. Like the most beautiful wedding. But I got to 9 p.m, which is my normal bedtime. I don't know about you, but...
No, same.
9 p.m. Okay. Yeah. I'd love to hear about everyone else's bedtimes, because I used to think that like 10, 11 o'clock was normal, and now I'm like barely ever see that time of day ever. But it got to 9 p.m. and I was like, yeah, I'm not actually having fun anymore. And we were staying the night. And so I went to bed for 2 hours. Yeah. I just took myself away from the party. I just didn't even I didn't really acknowledge it. Obviously George knew, but I was just like, okay, I'm going to go now. And I just went to bed. I put my pajamas on. I changed out of my recreational pants, the ones that you have to wear in a dress, put big pants on, put my pajamas on, got into bed, took all my hairpins out my hair, got into bed, went to sleep for 2 hours, got woken up by like a neighbour in the bedroom next door or whatever. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to go back to the party. And then I went back to the party till 1 a.m.
I can't believe you just said that, because I was literally about to say, wouldn't it be cool if, when you're on holiday and you go for dinner and then you come back and you have a couple of hours, like when you were younger, if you were going out, you like chill for a few hours, then you go out, properly out. And like some people would have a nap if they were going out in Europe because it was so late. And I was like, oh, it'd be such a cool idea if you like stay to the party till 10, because I'm the same as you. I get to like 10 and my social battery disappears. But I have faith in the fact that if I had an hour on my own to recharge, I could probably go back. And that's when the party gets really fun, like midnight, 1 a.m,
100%.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
I
missed
love
the
that.
first
Then-
dance, which was a shame.
Okay.
But and it was hilarious because I like reappeared on the dance floor and all my friends were like, Miri, yeah. I was like Jesus resurfacing from the cave. It was around Easter time. So, there we go. There's the story of me and how I'm managing my burnout. But you know what? I did what my body needed. Instead of pushing through and then crashing out and feeling terrible, I just did what I had to do. And that was probably one of the first times I've done that. And I've been trying to really keep going with, like, looking after myself. I said to you, didn't I, that I was like, this would make a great series on Instagram to, like, talk about my burnout, but I don't have the energy to do it.
I'd like to talk about burnout, but I'm too burned out to talk about burnout.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. Love it.
What about you? How have you been?
Yeah, good. I've got camp coming up this weekend and I'm so excited. Work's been very, very busy, so I've been like looking towards this with excitement. Went cross country schooling last weekend. Was a real test of my resilience and my mindset training. I've been feeling so confident on Harley, as I've been saying, and we've just been flying. And my coach described it today as like, this is what it's like having horses, is you're driving along and everything's great and then you hit a pothole. And so we had the new coach. I've not worked with her before. She was great. And from the very beginning, things started off quite, I would say, strong. Like normally when I go cross country schooling, we jump like a 60 centimetre log to begin, for example. We went straight into jumping 70 centimetre houses and then immediately into 80 centimetre houses. So it was all, which for me is really quite sort of big. And I was like flying and Harley's like really, big forward canter. We feel amazing. And then we kind of go around the corner and we come to this other jump and we jump that. And then she's like, right, come to this house it's like a house, but it's got mouse holes in the bottom, if you know what I mean?
Okay.
Like holes that a mouse could live in. And I take him up to it and I let him have a look at it and we do all of that. And we're going up to it and he does this thing where he sometimes will find a fence spooky. So he kind of backs off from like miles away. So he does this thing where he kind of backs off. And then sometimes I say, it's okay, we're going forward. And he goes, okay. And then he goes. So we're going up to this fence and he kind of backs off and I go, it's okay. And he goes, okay. So he starts kind of accelerating towards the fence. He's pulling me and I'm like, great. And then at the very last second, slams the brakes on. And I shouldn't say this because I think Nikki would tell me off, but I saw the photo when I was scrolling through the photos to get my actual pictures. I'm upside down. My foot is in the air. My head is about to hit the jump. And it did.
Jeez.
It hit the jump. So it was quite a sort of deceleration, I'd say. So I get back on. I'm like, oh, that was a bit of a knock to the head. But I got back on. Come round again. Jump something else. She's like, just come round again. So I come round again. I'm like, I'm just going to trot him into it so he can have a proper look. So I start trotting and then he's like offers me canter. So I'm like, great. So he goes up into canter. I'm like, he's got it. He's figured it out. And then at the last second, slams the brakes on again. And I fall off again. This time.
Oh my, same fence.
Same fence.
Oh.
So I was like, oh. So I was like, this is embarrassing. So I get back on again. Go on.
May I
Go
pose
on.
a question?
Yes.
In these moments, where do you find yourself looking when you're approaching the fence? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember for this one. I mean, I'm normally pretty good at looking up. Like if I look back at photos and stuff, I'm up. I am looking up. But for this one, and I have to admit, when I was talking it through with my coach, this fence was pretty towards the top of my limit. It was wide. It was pretty tall. It had these spooky elements. And I think if I'd felt a little bit more confident maybe with the coach, or maybe I'm making excuses, I might have said, I think that one might be a bit above our limit right now, I'm going to skip it. But I think because we were riding so high, I was like, oh, we'll just give it a go. And if he'd have jumped it, I wouldn't have thought twice,
No, I often say this is a really interesting thing that I think sometimes happens. People will jump around 14 jumps, for example. And I actually think you're really good at not doing this, but I definitely used to do it. And you hear people doing it all the time. Like the horse jumps 14 fences and knocks one of them down. And people are like, oh, we could have done this differently. That the feeling was this. Da, da, da. It instantly has like a really negative spin of the whole thing, because, and like you say, if you hadn't had that incident with that one jump, you would have been saying that this was the best cross country experience you've ever had, and even though actually 99% of it was still positive, the 1% draws us to that so much. It's such a normal human thing to do, right? I just think it's really interesting.
Well, what was really interesting about this was on the day, I got back on again, we went on, and I dropped the height for a little while. I went back to like 70, and then we jumped some 80s at the end. And he gave me phenomenal feeling at some things. Like, I showed him this skinny, and it wasn't flagged. And like made sure he knew where he was going from a while away, and he pulled me into it and he was on fire on some of these fences. We jumped skinnies and ditches and water and all these fun things. And on the day, I was like, wow, this feels like a real step forward in my mindset, because being able to get back on twice and then carry on jumping some quite beefy jumps, I just wouldn't have been able to find the bottle for that before. So that felt amazing. What was interesting for me is I had my weekly lesson today, or my bi-weekly lesson, and I got on today and I talked my coach through what happened, and I was like, so I just want to have a couple of pops before camp, so I feel like I'm going into that, and we started jumping down the grid, and I was like, I don't know, and she was like, what's going on, how are you feeling? I was like, I just feel I'm worrying about my stability all the time. And so we talked through it, and I think because I've never had a situation with Harley previously where he's been moving so much and then put the brakes on. And because I've worked so hard to build myself up to being confident in this really forward canter, like that's not very natural for me. I was like, well, it's okay because nothing bad happens in the forward canter. And of course now I've got this situation where he can actually put the brakes on really, really fast, or he has done. I know he's got the ability. So I was like, it's a bit stuck in my head, this idea that he can stop. So anyway, we kind of worked through some stuff, and my coach is mega and she knows us both so well. And by the end of the session, I was like, nope, I feel really good. I'm back to kind of a good level. I'm still thinking a little bit about it, but I feel good, confident going into camp jumping stuff. And I think it's really important to talk about, because when we talk about mindset training, I think there's this idea of like, it's going to be perfect. You're just never going to worry about stuff ever again. And Nikki's always reminding me, like, it's not about not being scared. It's just about how you're able to deal with that in the moment and move through it. And so I think it's just very good to be able to be like, I felt like that on the day, and I carried on and I felt fine. And I was like, yeah, this has been a great day. And then it was a couple of days after that I was like, maybe I'm not okay completely. And then but your resilience is higher, I guess,
Yeah, I think as well adrenaline has a big part to play in that kind of situation.
Yeah, for sure.
That probably brings us onto a bit of a conversation that we feel we want to chat about.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a bit of a weird segue, but I suppose adrenaline was one of the things that came up for me when people were talking about this topic. And this is the topic of the horse Golden Dancer, who very sadly suffered a fatal injury at the last fence in a race that happened at Aintree at the Grand National meeting. And the horse, I have watched the video, actually. I made sure that I did my due diligence for everyone. It's not worth watching. I don't recommend it. Well, it's interesting I say that, actually. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And that's, I think, important to understand. There's this awful picture that got circulated in the news in this moment where the horse landed. It went basically through the last jump and landed on the front of its back feet. Like, if you see a...
His legs are sort of dropped away behind him.
Yeah. And... Well, yeah, it's just, it's been a huge media storm, and, there's a lot of people that, and I'm not by any means giving my opinion when I say this, but there are a lot of people that are very against racing. And then there's a lot of people, obviously, that are very for racing, that would see this as part and parcel of the risk of the sport. It brings up a lot of questions about social license and horses in sport, and horses used for, doing some air quotes, entertainment. I mean, you've obviously seen the media storm. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on it. I really have. And I think my stance is that I don't like racing. I have worked with ROR before because I think that's at least something good that comes out of the industry. But I've also turned down every single opportunity that has come my way that has racing attached or is at a racing day, because I don't, it's not for me, and I don't believe it, and I don't want to share that with people. However, I was really torn with the narratives going around, because on the one hand, I nearly shared to my story that image and said, when people say they wouldn't do it if they didn't love it, I'm like, they would literally do it with a broken back, because that's how pressure and release and training works. That's one side of it. But the other side that I find really hard is the conversation that went around that was like, did the jockey know? Did they push the horse? Da-da-da. And I do find that really hard, because much as I don't agree with racing as a sport, I also fundamentally believe that the vast majority of people who work in racing, including jockeys, grooms and others, do really care about the horses. I know people who work in racing, and I fundamentally believe they adore their horses. Where I think it gets complicated is when money is such a big part of the day-to-day decision making. I find it impossible to believe that it doesn't sometimes come above, or maybe more often come above, the actual welfare of the horse. But then saying that, I'm like, is that the case for almost every amateur owner? Like we were saying last week, which is like, well, I spend all this money, I want to be able to ride the horse. And I mean, I'm convoluting a lot of things here, so I think it's a bit muddled. But I find it hard. I don't think it is black and white, stuff like that.
I think, in that moment, there would have been a split-second decision made. The adrenaline, I don't know if anyone else has ridden a racehorse. I actually never have. But I know for a fact that, I'll have jumped a course of fences and had a bit of an awkward jump, or the horse had a little stumble. Yep. And you do pick up your reins, you put your leg back on, and you keep going. Now, having watched the video, this horse goes through the fence, which, to be honest, these steeplechasers do a lot of. They don't jump those fences a lot of the time. They are going through them to a degree. This horse goes through that fence to a more extreme degree than your kind of average. And there is a weird moment where the horse moves really weird straight after. Like the hind leg kind of does this really exaggerated thing. And it will be because adrenaline was pumping through that horse. And at the end of the day, when we race horses, we are relying on their kind of flight instinct to a degree. They all run as a group, and then you have to train them to be brave enough to run ahead of the others. And there's only certain horses that make the cut, and that's why you end up with so many racehorses that don't end up being the great racehorses that we hear about. I don't know the numbers in the industry. It would be interesting to understand actually, like how many are bred and how many get to being the horses we see racing. But my point being is that in that moment, that jockey probably wouldn't have actually thought that they wouldn't have really been actually like, oh, did that feel? There's like a heat of the moment. And I'm not saying that they should have carried on. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do. And actually looking back now, like if I was to take Belle jumping a course of fences and she had a major stumble and one of her knees hit the ground, I wouldn't carry on. But that's me now. That's me having spent the last decade learning about horses, understanding how they work, knowing about injuries. So my perspective now is very different. And go on, you were going to say something, and then I'm going to say something else about your point about people in the industry.
Will you tap into something really interesting, which is like the conversation focused in on that particular jockey's decision. And we've seen this happen. And again, is it cognitive dissonance? Maybe, or maybe it's not cognitive dissonance, but like it's happened with dressage riders, for example, where people will throw the book at an individual, and sometimes it's there is a bar for that and there's a reason behind it, but they will then use that as a way almost to ignore like everything else. So and it feels like I don't know if it feels like racing looks less bad if this really bad thing can be pinned on one person, rather than being like, well, why are we in situations where horses are trained to keep going regardless? Is that a systematic way of training horses through whatever? Why are we putting jockeys under the pressure where they feel like if they knew they would do, you know what I mean? Like more of a systematic view. And again, I stand by the hope that this jockey didn't know before they crossed the line.
Yeah. I heard some I heard speculation that he pulled the horse up very soon after the line, and I cannot comment on that because I haven't seen that personally myself. Like the video I saw cut as the horses crossed the finish line, and it, if that did happen and he pushed the horse across the line and then immediately broke the horse back down to trot in a kind of unnatural time frame to normal. Normally you see people kind of, they're galloping and then they like drop the pressure. The horse kind of breaks to canter, trot, walk. And then that's it. They kind of all like taper off together because, galloping doesn't just stop. You can't go gallop to halt. That's not a transition. And so, there's so much nuance in that. And I think the fundamental thing for me that I struggle with in these situations is, and my partner, George, and I had a conversation about this actually that was really interesting, because I said when financial gain is really high up on the list of the priorities, which unfortunately in racing it was a £67,000 race, that will outweigh welfare. Unfortunately, that is often the case. If you think about people raising animals for financial gain, maybe this is a difficult association to make, but like people will love their beef cattle, but then they will essentially at the end of the day, the welfare of the animal is not considered because that animal's life is ended. Whether that life is ended in a kind way or not, I don't believe that's actually a thing. But anyway, I'm not getting into that. But my point is, when financial gain is or a salary or a life is one is over the other, like financially, then that choice is the animal is at the loss. And unfortunately, having worked in big yards and seen, a lot of... I worked at the sales, actually, when I was young. I helped do, like, the walking the yearlings out for people to look at. There are people that love them, but they still love them and are okay with them going into this industry. Like, and George said to me, he said, but there's financial gain in your business. And I said, but it is not driven at the cost of the animal. Yes, I make a living from the livery, training, the helping people, but the outcome of that is that people gain healing with their horses, rehabilitation, and it's like this complicated kind of muddled up system where we're like, we love the horses, but if they win us money. And that's really hard. And that is where I think this is so complex, and we must be careful. People are kind of, like you say, throwing this guy, pinning it all in one place. And the reality is, it's the wider financial element of human greed, really. The racing industry is, I don't actually know the numbers on this, but I would imagine it's a multi-billion-pound industry.
Yeah, without a doubt.
You think about the betting and the entries and I think about the number of people who work in the industry. These racing yards have hundreds of horses. They will have a lot of staff, a lot of people coming up through the whole thing. The whole system is enormous, and that makes it very complicated. because now we're all learning more.
So there are no doubt people listening to this who are, their blood is boiling and they are saying either out loud or in their heads, well, that's not true and we got that bit wrong. And if that is you, and you are somebody who works in racing and you fundamentally disagree with our arguments here and our thoughts, and you believe that racing where you are on your yard is done ethically and with welfare at the forefront, we would actually love to hear from you. I would personally love to have that conversation on the podcast. So it's open. As we've always said, we try really, really hard not to be one side or the other, and to have to play in the grey and to be open. So, you know, the door is open and our emails and DMs are.
With that being said, we also do have to remind you guys that these are just our opinions. You know, Rhi and I have lived our lives going in whatever direction those have gone in, and they have led us to where we are today. That doesn't mean that we are right. That doesn't mean that we are wrong, but we are entitled to, you know, feel the way we feel and say the things we say. I think it's important sometimes to remind people of that, because it can be a bit like we're not, you know, giving out the news. We are just reacting to what has taken place, which was a really major thing in the horse industry. And I think something that I would love, like we say, we'd love to talk about this more, because it's really important that we are talking about these things and we are having these open conversations with horse welfare at the forefront, because, you know, there'll be people listening to this that have just started an apprenticeship at a racing yard. And there's people saying, cancel the sport, you've got to get rid, da da da. And they're just falling in love with the fact that they're getting to, you know, love an athlete. And I think that's complicated and it's nuanced and it's not black and white and it's not like cancel the sport. And maybe it's regulation needs to be in place. And the RSPCA posted something very interesting that got 10 ton of hate underneath it, obviously, because the internet is angry at the moment. But they posted an interesting post saying basically like they are looking at everything. They are looking into it. They are actively investigating things that could be in place to you know, sustain better welfare. And maybe people say that is tone deaf or, you know, a drop in the ocean maybe, but we've got to understand that change takes time and these things aren't just going to happen. You're not going to cancel racing. You can't. It's not going to happen like that. And so it's how can we all move forward to understand better what's going on and to make sure that maybe things like this can be avoided while horses can still do the thing that they're good at. I don't know. Maybe that was a bad summary, but...
Speaking of moving forward and thinking forward, I am so excited for our guest today. Gillian Tabor is a chartered physiotherapist with over 20 years experience as an ACPAT vet physio. She is also a lecturer at Hartpury University. She's been there since 2013, lecturing in veterinary physio. And I had the absolute pleasure of seeing her at an event, a lecture series, and she was talking about the future of rehab, and it was the talk of the day that really stuck in my head, and I felt like she gave such data-led, actionable insights that just felt both really common sense led and also very future facing. So I'm really excited to chat to Gillian today, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it, whether or not you are currently rehabbing a horse. And if you are, we are with you, and we hope this podcast helps. Gillian, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight.
As are we. So before we get into any of the incredible detail that we've spoken about offline, give us a little introduction to you, your story, your journey, your horses. Yeah, tell us about you.
Oh, wow. Where to start? I guess probably the reason I became a physio to start with might be a good place. Yeah,
let's do it.
I, like, you know, most girls, I was animal mad, horse mad, cat, dog mad, and I wanted to be a vet. Probably wasn't clever enough to be a vet, but at the time of choosing my GCSEs, I actually had an injury myself, and I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, I tell you what, have some anti-inflammatories and, you know, stop doing the thing that makes it hurt and you'll get better. And I thought, oh, that's not very good. And my mother found a physio for me to go and see, and my physio treated me and helped me and got me back on my feet. And I thought, oh, that's really clever. And I also at the time had a pony. I show jumped up, very amateur, still very amateur now, but try and enjoy it as much as I can. But I had this pony that used to, and the description I'm sure you'll understand, motorbike round the corner in canter one way, and then was quite balanced in the other way. And we lived in Hampshire at the time, and we were recommended to have somebody to come out, a back person to come and see our pony. And I was fortunate enough that it was Amanda Sutton. Some people might recognise her name, but she was the British team physio, and she was sort of at the forefront of really getting physiotherapy for animals recognised, certainly in our area. And she treated my pony, and my pony became more equal on both reins. And so I thought, this is definitely what I want to do. And at that time, you had to go and do your human physiotherapy training first. So I did my GCSEs, did my A-levels, and then I went to Cardiff University and I became a chartered physiotherapist. I always knew that I wanted to go and work with animals, but it was the way in at that time. And I did my time in the NHS. So, I've sort of really built those skills with animals that can give you feedback, verbal feedback. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would do, and I carried on in outpatients for quite a long time. But around that time, the opportunity came up, and I did what was the way into it then, an apprenticeship with a physio called Anna Johnson. So Anna's in Hertfordshire, and she was also then the British team physio, and had a brilliant time with her and basically absorbed everything I could from her. And then the Royal Vet College started a Masters in Veterinary Physiotherapy, which I was the first cohort to join. So that was, I'm going to say this is a long time ago. I started in 1999, my Masters, my first Masters, I'll explain more later. And joined the RVC, and I then got my MSc in Veterinary Physiotherapy there. And so at that point, combined doing human physio and animal physio, and then went specifically more into equine physio, and then was running my business, came down to Devon in 2001, which is where I am now. So I've been working on my own business down here for 25 years now. And I still love it. I still wouldn't give up my clinical work, but probably I'm more here to speak to you about the other side of my job. So we can go into that if you like as well.
Miri, your eyes lit up there when Anna's name was mentioned.
She's just local to me. I just have heard a lot about her. I've never met her myself actually, but she's local to me. I'm in Hertfordshire, so I've heard about her, but I've never had the pleasure to meet her. But maybe I should.
I mean, I keep saying to our guests, I really love hearing about the invisible string that pulled someone to their career, and I love this idea that it was the fact that someone kind of let you down, that you were like, this can't be the way. And I love that that's actually quite representative of how a lot of us are learning with our horses. It's like, this can't be the only option, this can't be the only way. And I just think that's really lovely that you then were able to explore it. Before we get into your work, you were talking about something really fascinating before we jumped on the recording, which was the difference in your two horses. So tell us a little bit about that before we dive into the kind of the physio side of your work.
Oh yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to have a few horses over my lifetime, and I always dreamed of having a Lusitano. And so for one of my big birthdays a few years ago, I went to Portugal and I bought myself a Lusitano foal. I knew his breeding. I'd ridden a full sister of his in the UK. So bought him as a foal. He stayed out there as a 2-year-old, and then he came to the UK. And I, at the time, was very traditional, brought up through BHS Pony Club, and I absolutely love the idea of exploring starting a new horse in a new way. And alongside the timing of it, I actually learnt about equitation science, which is basically the evidence behind learning theory, how animals learn and applying it. And I did went to university. I did a research master's that was based around equitation science and did some research with it. But it really got me into this idea of how animals learn. So I tried all sorts of things with him. So he is now, unfortunately, he was diagnosed as sort of quite early aged with arthritis of his fetlocks. So he has, unfortunately, not progressed in his eventing or dressage career. And he's a Luso and he does jump and he loved eventing, but obviously I had to stop with the arthritis. But I then thought, well, what can I do with him? So he's basically a big Labrador, both in his appetite and his enthusiasm for people. He now is, he's barefoot, he works, I hack him bitless, but in the arena he does bridleless work. I've jumped him bridleless, and he is the most fun, optimistic horse. He just loves to learn. He just really, he's like input, teach me. He'll learn bad things that I shouldn't say bad things, things that I don't want him to learn as well. I did promise myself I'd never teach him to rear, but that went out the wayside when it was like quite good fun to do that with him. But I wouldn't necessarily practice that too often. So that's him, his Lusitano, who's great fun. But the other horses that we have are Irish sport horses. So I had another little mad moment when Leader the Luso was diagnosed with arthritis that I didn't want to give up eventing, so I bought a 4-year-old Irish sport horse who is now 6 this year, and he's starting his second season of BE eventing. So I have got complete extremes. I've got a Portuguese barefoot bridleless, and then I've got my Irish sport horse that is eventing with his shoes and his studs on. So that is they're quite extremes, but I think they're both happy horses. They enjoy what they do, and I certainly I couldn't do without either of my grey geldings.
One of the things that really shone for me in that little intro, Gillian, into kind of how you do things, is it's very evident that things are led by the individual horse. And I wonder if, have there been any other horses or things that come up for you that felt like kind of pinnacle moments for you in your learning that led you to do things the way you do them now, because you're kind of leading the way in certain instances when it comes to rehab, which is one of the major topics that we wanted to talk about today, and why Rhi was so inspired by your talk when she met you. But were there specific horses that made you go, that this needs to be different, or this is shaping what I want to do in the future?
I think probably it might be reflection on my own capabilities as a physio that may have shaped the decisions that I make now. When I started out, and I think this is probably the same for a lot of professionals, because you don't have that sort of catalogue of experience to refer to, it's very easy to fall into just following almost by rote something that you've been told, or a prescription, or even nowadays people go on the internet and they type in the problem and they have a week 1, week 2, week 3. And a couple of decades ago I was really guilty of that with rehab programs. I would have one, here's your kissing spines rehab program, off you go. And when you've done that a few times and it doesn't work, you realise that actually you have to individualise your approach. And the more that you take factors such as the owner, the horse, the environment, their sort of, absolutely, I list a whole ream of things that create that individual recipe. That's probably what's guided me more now. And having that confidence to try things and be able to evaluate as you go along is... that translates from owning my own horses as to why I've got very different horses and different approaches to them both. And also now, probably how I address each of my clients on a one-to-one, and also how I teach. I don't want my students at Hartpury to be replicates of me. I'm not perfect. There's lots of flaws in the way I do things. But what I'd like is for my students to make their decisions. I'd like owners to make their decisions based on the evidence. and follow that as their guide so that they can then choose the best for their horse. There is no one right way. There's also, there are a few very wrong ways, but there's a lot of okay ways, and we're all sort of finding our way. And to be able to evaluate, assess, and I'll get on my soapbox about objective measurement if you like later, but to be able to judge whether or not you're on the right path and actually narrowing down on what is the right path for you is all based on that reflection and action cycle that it fits in every industry.
I've definitely experienced this. I do a lot of rehab, and I'd love to learn from, no doubt I'll be learning things this evening from you, but I've always really struggled, and I think that you align with this because you kind of already said it, but like this approach to rehab where you'll get a fairly, let's use a retrained racehorse, for example, with kissing spine as an example. I've helped countless number, and they go to the vets, and the vets will say, here's your program, we're going to do this, and then people are very much led to believe that is like potentially after surgery is one of the major ones I've seen it. Do this much rehab, do this, and you will have you can start riding again. And I think this is a really, I don't know if you'll agree, you are nodding, so hopefully this is true, but this is quite like a dangerous way of guiding people through horse ownership, because like we spoke about, Rhi earlier used a great analogy of like, you're going along, everything's great, and then you hit a pothole. And the reality is that it's a very potholey road with horses, and it's not a very sort of, you can't plan it, you can't control the road, you have to just go with what the road offers. And it's this lack of awareness or lack of whole horse approach that I've really struggled with helping people with, because vets give this kind of program. And can you talk a little bit about how you do that differently? Like, how do you help people individualize their horses in their rehab rather than just this one size fits all?
Well, a very simple example of the rehab is a little bit later on, when you've gone through your first stages, you might get recommended that you need to do hill work. Now, where I live in Devon, finding a flat piece of road is nigh on impossible. Every bit that you do once you're out of your gates is going to be up or downhill. Whereas I believe, if you live on the east of the country, finding a hill is going to be a challenge for you. So imagine if you've got a rehab program that says week 10, walk or trot up hills. That's not going to be possible to do. And just thinking about what I've just said there, I said week 10, walk up and down hills. And when you look at those sort of formatted rehabilitation plans, it will be week 1, week 2, week 3. And I fundamentally believe that is our wrong approach. We should be using milestones, not time frames, when it comes to judging whether to move on. So has your horse achieved everything that it needs to do in that first group of, that first phase? If they have, then you can move on. Has it got the capacity to tolerate what you're asking it to do for the next stage? And your example there of your racehorse post-kissing spine surgery, if you look at a standard, we call it, the ligament snip, it would potentially say that you could be on board and riding at 8 weeks. Or if you've had an ostectomy, a bone reshaping, it might say, right, week 12, get on. But there's so many variables in that before you can decide whether you're going to get on. So week 12 is irrelevant. Have you ticked off everything to get to that stage before you even consider putting a saddle on the horse? And so those prescriptions that are, they look to be progressive, they're optimistic at best. They're not going to suit every horse that's out there.
Oh, this is bringing back a lot of my rehab. And you can see why vets do it, because it's very easy for an everyday horse owner to go, okay, for a week I'm going to do 5 minutes of walking, and then in the second week I'm going to do 7 minutes of walking, and it's going to look like this on this surface. And that is very easy to do. And I know at the most simple end, you talked about how it shouldn't be a 5-minute increment every week. It should be like 30 seconds every day building up. But you talked about other elements that you're looking for. So what are those? I mean, maybe just some examples. What are the kinds of things you're looking for? Is it changes in the way that the horse moves? Is it behavioural? Like, what are those things if it's not time frames and structured weeks, for example?
So what we need to do is to pick out some key elements that we can use for assessment as we go through the whole rehab programme. So one of the fundamentals for a riding horse is its ability to tolerate the load of the saddle and the rider going onto the back. So without load, what I'm interested in is can the horse maintain an optimum posture through all the exercises that you're asking them to do. And obviously, you know, your walking in hand can progress to walking on slopes, walking on turns and circles, and it's the behaviour of the horse along with that, you know, postural maintenance that then lets me go, okay, well, can we now go a little bit faster and can we maintain it? And then we can get into the finer detail of thinking about muscle development, and alongside that, of course, is the pain, and is that being managed, and are we making sure that there's no behavioural elements because of the pain that we need to address. So if you pick a few of those ideas, you know, for me, posture and maintenance, that spinal position is key, I think, for a riding horse, but other people might have other ideas. But can you do that? And then you know, are you going to be able to do that alongside the function that you're trying to achieve? So every single riding horse has to have the capacity to tolerate the weight of a rider on them. But then are they going to jump? Are they going to be doing dressage? Are they going to be doing endurance? Are they going back into racehorsing? Are they going back into racing? So the broad foundation for every horse is the same, and then you can become more specific and tailoring your rehab, and then your rehab will naturally translate into training. We said this before we came online. We're talking about this idea that actually there's not a huge fundamental difference between rehab and training. All it is the decision making on the exercises that you select for the right reasons at the right time, the dose, i.e. the intensity, the frequency, and the repetitions that you do with them, and all of that. Then if you can achieve each of those phases and you can tick them off, then you can progress on to the next one. And it is more aligned, I think, with modern human rehab. So there's certain ideas that are linked to what they call return to play. So if you've had a cruciate ligament repair and you want to go back into, say, netball, you're going to need to be able to pass your triple hop test. So you're going to be able to have to do standing jumps, and you're going to have to be able to hop 3 times. You're going to be able to be measured, if they've got the equipment, on a machine that's going to measure the strength in your quads and your hamstrings and compare the ratio between your quads and hamstrings and compare between left and right. So if we translate that into our equine rehab, that human is not ticked off to go back to sport at 6 weeks. They're ticked off to go back to sport when they've achieved those certain metrics. So going back to where I was starting with the maintenance of the posture, are they comfortable? Are they behaving? Are they able to tolerate circles, increases in speed, and maintaining that then with the saddle on? We can sort of get an idea of what we're looking for before we progress on to our return to sport with our horses.
This is music to my ears, Gillian. I have been... We could be great friends. I think we should. I just mean in the sense of, it's almost not what we're doing, but how we're doing it that is going to lead us to that change. And I mentioned before, and I just kind of want to say this because I think it's a kind of quite a good one-liner, is that I always see rehab as an opportunity. I see it as, I've had a horse, my own lovely Zora, she broke her splint bone, she got kicked in the field, and I had always struggled with some elements of her using the way she used her body, and it was almost like she'd got quite fit in the wrong way. And then when she became very unfit because she had this splint bone injury, I was like, right, I can start again. I get an opportunity. It was like that silver lining to this rubbish thing that happened. And I was wondering, you know, it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about kind of pain, basically, and because the things that you're discussing, you know, postural change, ability to carry load, do you talk to people about sort of monitoring pain? Because often these, you know, procedures are kind of like the hope that they're going to kind of fix, I'm doing some air quotes, the problem. So like the kissing spine, for example, I have a real, this is just my opinion, and I would be very interested to hear your opinion on it, whether you're happy to give it. But I don't really agree with something like kissing spine surgery, because I've seen horses that have had kissing spine surgery, they've gone through a rehab protocol, and depending on the efficiency and good practice of the rehab is what brings them back to a place of being a ridden horse again. It wasn't really the surgery in the first place. The surgery maybe gave a break in discomfort, but often those horses do return back to a negative place. That didn't really make much sense, but can you touch on this kind of topic? Does it fire you up in the same way it fires me up?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The most frustrating thing for me is to be referred a horse post-surgery. I would always prefer to see a horse before surgery. But before I go a little bit into that, you brought up this question about pain, and I think pain is the number one area that we need to address, because everything in a horse, its behaviour, its movement patterns, its potential to rehab, is all going to be affected by pain. So we can't change a way a horse moves fundamentally if it's moving that way because of pain. So, okay, therapeutic exercise can be pain relieving in itself. So we know that from people, don't we? You can be a bit stiff and sore, and you can move yourself through your body and feel better for it. But if there's an underlying pathology that's causing a lameness, that horse is going to adapt and compensate for the lameness. And so no matter what I do as a therapist or as anybody else in my industry, unless you address that underlying cause, you're not going to be able to really fundamentally change things as much as you want to anyway. So if we think about a horse that has an underpinning back pain, has something that is causing the way that they're moving to be adapted, if I go in and a short-term, manual therapy, maybe electrotherapy, I can change what's happening. But what we're more interested in is that longer term approach. So it may be that musculoskeletal treatment and exercise is our way forward, but it may be that we need to get the multidisciplinary team involved. So, the vet certainly, but things like changing foot balance, changing the saddle, changing the nutrition for the horse. Sometimes, I have been known to make mothers cry when I say that their child has sadly outgrown their pony. Sometimes it may be an issue of the rider and the horse being a mismatch, either from experience levels or capabilities or the environment. But all of that needs to be considered as well, alongside the idea of pain. And then addressing your point about surgery, it's a very emotive subject. Some people feel very, very strongly that it's the wrong thing to do, and some people feel that it's the only way for addressing kissing spines. But if we go back to the literature, what we do know is there is a very high proportion of horses that have kissing spines that don't have pain. So some of the literature cites, somewhere between 75 and 90% of horses have evidence of kissing spines if you were going to x-ray their back. But not all of those are painful. So my interest is what triggers a horse that has, a back like that to become painful in the first place, and how can we reverse that? Now, if it's posturally related, so maybe we don't have changes in the bone yet, but we have inflammation, that is relatively easy to address with treatment, with pain management, postural re-education, exercise strengthening, removing the cause. If we are, further down the line and we actually have overriding dorsal spinous processes, and more importantly, we don't have any other lamenesses, and it has been localised that the problems that the horse is having is because of pain coming from its back. Again, the literature shows that the outcomes of surgery of horses that have changes in behaviour after they've had nerve blocking through their back are going to be better. So those are the horses that are more likely to be a candidate and have the better results after surgery. But there's a whole spectrum of horses in between, and my preference would be pain management and rehab first. Get off their backs, spend the duration doing rehab and see whether you can change them before you opt to the surgery. I think the challenge that we have is that, maybe I'm getting a little bit political and speaking out of my area, but a lot of the clients have insurance policies that have a short-term, choice to make after you've had diagnosis. So, if you've only got a year to decide whether to have surgery and have the claim covered, you're going to be rushing into surgery quicker. If you didn't have that time frame and you had the choice to go, right, okay, let's spend 6 months rehabbing our horse with conservative treatment first, I think that might be, change the horses going for surgery in this country as well.
And do you see commonly? Sorry, Rhi. One more thing.
No, you
just me and kissing spine. I'm really interested in this because I have got a couple of horses who have close vertebra, and like you say, it's not a pain reaction, but I know it's there. I also have a thoroughbred with congenital kissing spine, whose spine is, I think, now completely fused, which is another total topic. But one of the interesting things that I commonly see, and I'm interested to hear your take on this, is that those horses who, like you're saying, this approach is so relevant because so commonly the spine isn't the only area of the body that is in compensation or in dysfunction. Can you touch on that? Because you really talk about this very whole horse approach, which I think is what is often missed. It's like pain in the back, do the kissing spine surgery, you're going to have a ridden horse. And the reality is the compensation in the back, with the posture being not good, maybe was caused by something else, the foot balance, and it's this whole cycle.
Yeah, it's so complex, but that's if you read into this concept of dynamical systems theory, that everything is interlinked and you cannot separate the whole cogs, the whole system. It becomes like you go, that's what's happening. But again, pulling from the biomechanics literature is really interesting. So in the research that we have with regards to inducing lameness, it's just temporarily induced by a special shoe that has a screw that's just tightened into the sole of the foot, and it's reversible instantly. But this research has shown us so much about how horses compensate for lameness. So as well as redistributing their weight, we know that they change the way they move their backs. So they tend to go into a stiffer and more extended posture if they are struggling to compensate for lameness through their legs. So you can imagine that if you've got a horse that has even a very slight, something that you can't see by eye, an asymmetry to the way they're moving in the hind leg, then everything through that whole chain, all the way up through the, through the stifle, through the hip, through the lumbosacral region and into the back is going to be affected by the horse trying to compensate for it. Now, a wild horse, a feral horse, all it needs to do is to graze and then occasionally gallop away from predators. That doesn't affect it at all. And they can function completely normally. But then when you put a rider on board, and again, going back to the literature, we know that you put weight on a horse's back and that induces an extended posture as well, then you can see how that's going to compromise that whole system. So when we talk about the capacity to tolerate the load of the rider, we want a horse that's able to resist that effect of gravity and the mass going on their back. But if they've got a lameness at the same time, then we've got competing systems. So you can have back pain, you can have secondary back pain, you can treat the back pain, but firstly you can't rehab them as you want to, because quite commonly the lameness comes out at that point, it becomes apparent, or the whole horse is just fighting, the whole body is trying to say, well, no, I can't do what you're asking me to do because I'm too busy trying to deal with all these other issues. So talking about surgery, you really don't want to operate on a horse unless you know that there isn't anything else going on. And that's why the idea that you could actually put in your diagnostic analgesia, you can nerve block them through their back and then sort of retest to see whether that's made a difference, just like a vet would do when they're doing a lameness exam, I think is something that if it was my horse and I was deciding whether or not I wanted to put them forward for surgery, is something that I would, ask to be done before I made that decision. But Miri, you said, your thoroughbred with the congenital kissing spines. Unfortunately, our thoroughbreds, the purpose of a thoroughbred, basically fundamentally, the breeding, is to run fast in a straight line with a really stiff extended back. And the reason that that's useful is because all the force generated from the hind limbs can then be turned into propulsion and pushing the horse going forwards. So we've not sort of thought about how we're breeding horses, the thoroughbreds, to have a decent back. All we're interested in is those performance gains. So I think somewhere along the lines, our anatomy of the thoroughbred's back has unfortunately predisposed it to kissing spines, because they have a beak shape to their dorsal spinous processes, which makes them closer anyway. So thoroughbreds are really overrepresented in the literature when it comes to having kissing spines. But a thoroughbred that's got kissing spines and all it has to do is race is probably going to function normally. But then when you ask it to go around circles and be a dressage horse, the poor thing is not going to be able to manage to do it.
That is so interesting. Hey, I'm learning so much. Honestly, if you guys obviously will only see clips of this on Instagram, but my eyes are like, what? What? The interesting thing is, Gillian, is so she's 7 now. She was born in 2019, so she's 7. And so she will be probably coming close to establishing her body. Now, one of the symptoms that I saw, she was a perfect girl to be backed. She never gave me a tiny bit of an inkling that she was in discomfort. The only thing that she began to do around 4, going 5 years old, she would swish her tail when I tacked her up. And it was it wasn't the saddle, it was the girth. So when I then spoke to my vet and I said that this was the symptom, and we actually looked at her anatomy, and she basically is like this much space, very short in the back. He said, I think she's worth x-raying. And I was obviously devastated when I found out. She's never been trained the wrong way. She's always had great posture. Like, I'm like a postural, just like my thing. And so I was obviously devastated. But the interesting thing is one of the things I did notice was she cantered always since a baby, like Phoebe from Friends. Like, kind of, I don't know if you, like, kind of random and a bit sort of, kind of like her heart. Yeah, and like her quarters would like twiddle off to one side, and then they'd go off the other side when she was going down, like cantering down a hill in the field. And I was always like, that's really weird. Really interesting. She's 7 years old now. I turned her out at our new facility, and that's the first time I've seen her canter around a field in a while. And they had a good old go at it because they were having a lovely time. And she could canter straight down a hill, like just her back. Her hind leg didn't swing. She looked really balanced, and I'm like, this is interesting. And I groomed her the other day, and I was palpating her back, and I thought, this is definitely not as responsive as it used to be. And so I'm very interested because I plan to re-x-ray her back, and who knows, maybe Dee Dee will get to be a riding pony again one day. I don't know. Very interested to see. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about thoroughbreds, kissing spine, predisposition, and the different shape of their physical internal anatomy. That's just, I didn't know that.
Yes, I think it's tough for people because, those that want to have a thoroughbred that's come out of racing, We all know that they've been backed, very early on. They've had their riders on board, and they've been trained in a certain way that sounds, quite different to the way that your young horse is approached. And, a lot of them do come out with pathology. They come out with kissing spines, and it's tricky. I see a lot of these racehorses that are rehabbing, and it takes a lot of commitment from owners to try and restore a healthy spine in the horses that have been through that. But I don't know. I think if we were to assume that every horse has the potential to have painful kissing spines, and we treated them like that, so we managed their exercises, we ensured that everything that we can do in terms of the saddle fit, the exercises we choose, the way we ride them, our variety in our work, everything that we could do to prevent onset of pain in the back. I think just assuming that every horse could have kissing spines might actually make every horse a little bit more comfortable.
This is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to move us from back to two other Bs, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is box rest and barefoot, sort of. And I think the reason, to give you context, Gillian, that I spend time thinking about this is because I actually lost my previous horse after about a year of trying to rehab from a really horrendous pedal bone fracture. He had really big side bone in both front feet, and one of them broke at the base and it went down through the pedal bone. He also had hock arthritis, and so everything was really unbalanced, and it's just lots of secondary issues. And when we MRI'd him, it was like a shopping list, so it wasn't great. And during that process, we did everything to the letter, to your point, and he spent in fact all of that rehab period on box rest, either with some form of walking exercise or whatever. And he also had shoes that had pads on. And I think a lot now about, a few years later, I often think, God, I would hate to have to do that again with a horse. Because, of course, you don't sign up to do a year of box rest or whatever it is, 9 months. You always think it's going to be 3 or 6 weeks, and then it just gets extended and extended and extended. And I spend a lot of time thinking now, about the trade-off of okay, the box rest keeps the limb still, but at what cost for the rest of his body and his mental health and all the other things. And equally with pads and shoes, sometimes I think if I'd just taken him barefoot in the beginning, even though he was lame, would that have made things worse? Would it have eventually helped? And I sort of just think about these things a lot. So what's your perspective? Maybe we start with box rest, because I know Miri, for example, with Zora, it was Zora, wasn't it, with the splint bone, you had been advised a period of box rest, and you actually said, I'm going to do 2 weeks or whatever it was, I think, to make sure the limb is still, but then she's going in a field. Talk me through this.
No, that wasn't quite what I did. But it was very interesting because she had an open fracture because she got kicked, and the splint bone was just there was a dangly bit. It was completely detached. There was a big gap. And so I was prescribed box rest. We did 3 months of box rest. She got really fat. She actually tolerated it remarkably well because she's just such a good girl. But obviously it wasn't good for her. And then we re-x-rayed, and there was no inflammation in the leg, but we still had this weird dangly bit of splint bone. There was just a gap, basically. The leg was really healthy looking. The wound was healed. Horse was sound. And my vet said, look, we've got 2 options here. You could go and surgically remove the dangly bit, but you're looking at more rest, more this, more that. Or we can try, and he's very good. He's a very whole horse vet, and I'm very fortunate to have him. He said we can try introducing movement and see whether if then inflammation occurs, then you can go down doing something about getting rid of the chip, because sometimes the lump of bone basically aggravates the tissue around it. Anyway, so we gave her some settling, put her in a paddock, did that for a few days, then a bit more space, up until the point where she was just being in a field with a horse. And within a fortnight, this was the fortnight bit, we re-x-rayed again. Was it 4 weeks? I can't remember. It was not a very long period of time. We re-x-rayed and the bone had started to put itself back together again. And it was at that point I thought, interesting. Did I need to do 3 months? Did I just need to give the joint, the area a chance to heal the wound externally? And then could I actually have introduced gentle activity. And we did a lot of hand walking alongside the paddock turnout as well. So it was controlled exercise to create stimulation of the leg. But it was just very interesting because actually the fracture, you know, did air quotes again, but the bony, chunky, whatever bit, it needed movement to make it do the thing.
Can we just have a nod to our poor horse owners that don't have choices when it comes to being able to decide whether or not they can, you know, have box rest or turn their horse out? I would like to just support some of the people out there that would like to turn their horse out, but they're at a livery yard and they're not allowed to have a small paddock, or they have to go in a herd or something like that before I then say what I'm going to say, because I think it's so difficult that, you know, on social media where people go, I would never put my horse on box rest, or, you know, they will give you, you know, an opinion and they'll make people feel so bad for their circumstances.
Yep.
So
I had people say that to me because my horse ended up doing almost a year, which is horrific when you say it like that. But it doesn't start like that. And when you're staring down the barrel of you keep them on box rest or you turn them out and you'll be out there in an hour putting that horse to sleep, you keep your horse on box rest. And it's not a black and white thing. It's very difficult. So I think that's a very, very kind thing to do, and absolutely agree. Yeah.
But saying that, if we think about, again, I always like to go back to the research, and when I think about what we do with our human patients now compared with what I used to do with them when I was first qualified, so if we think about hip and knee replacements, if I had a patient on my orthopaedic ward in the hospital that had a hip replacement back in the 90s when I first qualified, they would be on bed rest for 3 days, not allowed to get out of bed. And then day 3 or 4, they could sit at the edge of the bed, and then they would be in hospital for a week to 10 days. Now, my father-in-law has just had his second hip replaced, and he was in and out in 1 day after going up the stairs on that afternoon and being discharged home. So,
Wow.
very sharp intake of breath then. But what we're doing, we are understanding more and more about adaptation and our responses to movement, and also I think we're getting more confident with our human patients about the procedures that we're doing with them. What we have with the equine side is a little bit more challenge. So our horses that have had kissing spine surgery, for instance, if they were to get an infection in those wounds, the surgical sites across their back, that potentially could be catastrophic for them. So the vets are understandably a little bit sensitive about you turning your horse out post ligament snip and enrolling in the field 48 hours after surgery, whilst it's got potentially areas that, you know, bacteria could get in and cause an infection. And so I sort of have to sort of balance my views on early movement and getting out of the box and not having extended durations of box rest with understanding the fundamentals of healing and risk management. The other thing that we can't do with our humans that I can do with my father-in-law is give them instructions about what they are and are not allowed to do. So you've had a horse that's had bony resection of its kissing spines. It's had bone essentially, you know, carved and chipped away, and it's a massive site of inflammation and risk of bleeding. So you don't want your horse turning itself inside out within, you know, a time frame of that surgery. So we are going to have to be a little bit stricter with our animals, and it's the same with dogs that have surgery, cats that have surgery, with our horses compared with what we think might be optimal for them, because we have to, you know, we have to be that voice of reason on their behalf, because we all know that, you know, if at all possible, they'll go into self-harm. So ideally, yes, we want controlled exercise, and controlled loading. And for some horses that might be safer for them to be in a box, but for other horses that it might be that yes, they can get out into a small pen really early on, that you can then extend the size. And one of the research studies that we're writing up at the moment was actually trying to establish a way of measuring how much activity horses are doing. So there are papers that have looked at the difference in horses walking on track systems and fields, and the distance that feral horses move compared with the stable horses. And just actually interesting, I don't know whether you might find it important to know that a feral horse will walk 18 kilometres a day, whereas a horse in a stable that's exercised, say, for half an hour in an arena, might only walk, 1.5 to 2 kilometres a day. But actually measuring that, you put two horses out, and my two horses, my Lusitano, that I told you is like a Labrador, he goes, I'm out grass. And then my, more sport horse bred thoroughbred has to go out and move legs. They wander around, they stand and they look at the horizon, they move. So those two horses need to be managed differently when it comes to monitoring how much activity they do. But where was I going with that? Oh yes, thinking about deciding whether or not your horse should be turned out or not. I think it's it's an individual decision, and it has to be based on so much information and so many parameters that I don't think it's as easy as saying horses should never be on box rest, or horses should be out all the time. I think it's something that the owner, the yard, the vet, the team have to make a decision about for each horse, for each individual circumstance.
I think that's fair. I think even knowing that you could maybe have the conversation that there's not a hard and fast rule is like an interesting thing to know. What's your view on shoes and kind of remedial shoeing versus barefoot? And would it be too much to take a horse barefoot during a lameness, for example? Because obviously we know barefoot transitions can be challenging for horses. But I sometimes look at remedial shoes now and I think, it's quite a lot of apparatus. Is that the word? You know what I mean? Stuff. And then I think transitioning away from that. And again, this is partly clouded by my own thing of like, we couldn't get him sound enough to retire. And I remember one of the final hurdles we were trying to get to was taking his shoes off. But I mean, he was really bad in the end. But like, it always sticks in my head that I kept thinking, and obviously it's not logical, but in my mind I was like, if I'd just taken the shoes off earlier, maybe he would have retired, which he wouldn't have. That is not logical. But it did make me think about barefoot as part of rehab.
So I think this is a little bit outside my scope of practice, but in discussion with the multidisciplinary team, I think you have to consider all of those options. So, the packages that are applied on the horse, are they making that horse more comfortable? I do... I said I've got a horse that's barefoot. He uses boots when we go. He comes out hacking on the lead rein with us. He needs those if he goes into the Forestry Commission because he can't cope with the little flinty, chippy surfaces. On the tarmac, he's fine. What does upset me about this whole discussion is the idea that every horse could potentially go barefoot and be fine with it. You mentioned about that transition period, and I have seen a number of horses that are really compromised. They are so sore, and I have concerns for their welfare where people are being so dogmatic about the fact that they have to have the shoes off and they're keeping them off, and that horse is suffering whilst it's going through that transition. So I think it's a huge discussion, and I'm sure you can find somebody that's got a lot more experience with it than I have, but I would like to make sure that anybody that makes that decision watches their horse and see how they're coping with it.
Well, funnily enough, this is one of our sponsors of some of the episodes of the podcast is Hoof School, and they do these sort of online learning modules that are all about hooves and anatomy and barefoot and trimming and lots of areas like that. And one of the key modules is actually understanding the difference between what is transition and horses who are uncomfortable on specific surfaces for short periods of time, and what is a horse who is in pain and when you need to pause, when you need to add more support, when you need to pull back, so that you don't get to a place where you're being dogmatic to your point and you are saying this horse must go barefoot in this way no matter what. And I think it's important that we know that there are people out there who are advocating for a balanced approach in all ways. So yeah, I think that's a very fair point. Yeah.
And I think some of the people that we have had that have spoken about this is often that it's so specific to every horse, and that there are some horses that are made sound essentially by shoes, and those horses are, there's a word like technically sound essentially because they've got the shoe added. And I think often there's this, like you were saying, this dogmatic kind of very sort of, oh my god, this is totally the only way, and that one size fits all. And the reality is, and Rhi and I have spoken about this a number of times, is people who come to me with horses who are very compromised feel very confident about going through that transitional period because I can support them in that, because I've done it loads of times, and I know, like you're saying, when a horse is just feeling slightly uncomfortable on certain surfaces, like we've moved, and a couple of my own horses who have been barefoot for years and years and years and years, walked on stony surface, got stone crunching hooves, have become a bit foot sensitive, and I think it's because of deficiency of a mineral, rather than suddenly something is terribly wrong and they're all crippled lame, because they're not. But it's like this, it's this nuance to it, like we're talking about with all of this awareness, this education, this learning, these small things that enable us to make these informed choices. And when you have people around you who are like, you've got this, this is going to be okay. Rhi and I talk about Harley wearing shoes a lot, don't we? And I'm like, if he was with me, I'd be like, he'd be okay. We would help him. And if he wasn't, we would know, and we'd put shoes back on or support him with boots and pads, whatever we got to do. And it's like this is what I think people lack, is often it's having people around them who are like, we can do this. I'm going to hold your hand, like you do evidently for your the clients that you have, Gillian. And I'd love to hear a little bit about, some of those common ways that you work with people to offer them that support that maybe is sometimes lacking in these sort of situations. Like people go to the vets, they get their rehab plan, they come back home, bye. What next?
Yeah.
I think it boils down to communication. I think being able to communicate your reasons why you're suggesting what you're suggesting, giving your clients the opportunity to have sort of informed decisions, deciding which route they want to take, and the reasons behind why you are recommending one thing over another, and giving your clients the confidence that they know what they're doing. So, for instance, with regards to rehab exercises, there's plenty of people out there that talk about the correct way of doing things, and if you don't do them the correct way, you're damaging your horse, and it makes people fundamentally scared to try things, or it tends to restrict people's freedom of expression to go, actually, my horse is comfortable, so maybe what I will do is I might do a few more sets and reps, or actually, no, my horse today is tired. They didn't recover from the session that I did yesterday enough, so I've decided that I'm not going to push the number of number of poles we do for today, for instance. So I think that communication and then the education gives the client confidence, and if you give them a bit of a pathway of what they're looking for and what's going to happen next and when they can move on, you get that sort of that buy-in with the client and the engagement with them. I think the current way that social media works, this sort of, we've talked about this dogma, this evangelical way you have to do things. An example that I do, which like shocks people, is that when I do my carrot stretches, and I do that in air quotes because they're not stretches and you don't have to use carrots, but when I do them, I don't necessarily want my horse to be stood square each time that I'm doing them. But people can spend hours squaring their horse up before they even start doing the exercise. And my argument is that we know that the dynamic mobilisation exercises, their correct term, the carrot stretches, switch on the abdominal muscles, they change the posture of the back, they get movement through the back. And when we ride our horse, it's never stood square. So how about doing those exercises to get those core muscles working when we've got one leg slightly in forward of the other, or one leg slightly turned out? Because actually in real life, function isn't a square horse. So not worrying about getting your horse square, sticking to the exercises that we know have more of an effect, scrapping, throwing out the exercises that are a waste of time, spending time doing the right things, hopefully in the right way, is probably going to progress you a lot more than being so correct all the time that actually you don't get anything done. So I think it boils down to explaining to your client why you want to do the things you're doing and giving them that rationale and that reasoning, and then hopefully giving people the confidence just to crack on and enjoy the time with the horse as well. Rehab's hard enough without worrying and lying at bed at night whether your horse was square or not, I think. But that's my approach anyway.
And that actually probably leads us quite nicely on to something you said earlier about essentially prehab and rehab, and how prehab should be rehab is part of training essentially. So I think everyone knows that we should probably be doing more carrot stretches than we are, and that should be part of our regular routine perhaps with our horses. Are there other things that you're quite passionate about that you think have an outsized impact in terms of routine, or things that people can do or not do that you think are particularly important?
Exercising your horse without the rider on board, I think, should be a fundamental part of your week. You should be learning how to help your horse move in a way that is going to then translate to the sport or the activity that you're doing from the ground. It's not standing in the middle with your horse with a training aid going round and round circles on the lunge. It's actually doing something that looks a little bit more like classical groundwork. Can you move your horse away from you? Can you go sideways? Can they go backwards? And those actually, spending 5 minutes doing that before you get on your horse as a dynamic warm-up as well, really sets the system up for working well. Really simple to do. And, the groundwork, I think people sort of think that it doesn't really offer enough, but in my experience sometimes that can be much more useful than some of the other things that we do with our horse. And the groundwork before as well, from a behavioural point of view, I don't know who said this, but your pre-flight checks, how is your horse moving? You're assessing them. Can they step under with the left and right? Are they bending equally to both directions? How's their behaviour? How's their temperament on the day? I think just interspersing that in your weekly routine is something that I recommend.
I love this. And Miri's lighting up because obviously she's groundwork queen. I've heard before about how backing up can lift a horse. I mean, you might have said it in your talk actually, lift a horse's back before you get on, and that makes perfect sense to me. We had an interesting conversation maybe 2 weeks ago, last week, with Mia Rodley, who does a lot of groundwork and liberty work actually. And you were talking about going sideways and moving your horse away. And she had an interesting perspective on turning hind leg, which is a key part of a lot of kind of groundwork practices, was that she felt like, or I think it was like stepping under with the hind leg is actually quite a big, crossing, what was the terminology?
She
like turning
she
hind leg, wasn't it?
More so, Mia was talking about
doesn't need to be regular.
No, yeah, and basically the disengaging of the hind leg, using the disengaging of the hind leg to downscale the energy is something that once you've learned it, you don't want to overuse it, was what she was talking about, because she has had a horse who she went to that too often and created dysfunction in the body.
Yeah. So I was sort of interested in your perspective on that.
I think the idea of disengaging the hind leg is slightly different from sort of a biomechanical beneficial use of placing the hind leg under the body. So when you ask the horse to step forward and under their body with a hind leg, as a response, you get a lateral flexion through the spine, so the ribs move to the opposite side. So you get a lengthening through the opposite side of the body, and hopefully you should get a little bit of flexion, a little bit of lift of that whole trunk, of the whole core up as well. So as well as my suggestion that you don't have to stand square when you do your carrot stretches, I upset people hugely when I say I'd like you to do lateral work but do it really badly. So we all know that in a dressage test you have to do your shoulder in on 3 tracks, and you have to, you know, maintain a certain body position when you do leg yield. But actually, from a mobility and a suppleness point of view, we can do more than that with our lateral work. We can do it badly. We can ask the horse to leg yield away. We can ask them to serpentine through changes of bend. You know, we can move leg yielding into shoulder in. We can play with how they move their body and where they position their legs. And if you're, you know, if you want to do it really well, do it from the ground without the rider impeding you impeding the movement of the horse's back when you do that. But you can actually see how the horse then takes their whole body through all the ranges of movement. And one of the things I think that we tend to get a little bit obsessed with riders is this sort of one picture of how a horse moves. Well, actually, we need a horse to move in all different postures. There's no right or wrong posture, so long as it's a changing posture. So whether the head is on the bit or whether it's forward and down, there are some positions that I don't want to maintain and all the time, but it's important that they go into those positions to then come out of them. One of them, for example, is I call it the Hoover pony. You know, when they're going along and their nose is just bumping along the ground. Well, at that particular point, yes, you know, they are lengthening all the way through the top line, but they're actually using the nuchal ligament. They're just hanging on their passive structures. There's not a huge amount of muscle activity to do that, and it doesn't translate to a ridden posture. So although, you know, we want a horse to be able to stretch down and come back out again, I'm not going to say to a client, keep them in that position for, you know, hours and hours and hours. I want them to be able to come up and through. And the one that I would suggest avoiding the most would be a really high head and neck position, because we know when their head goes high, then their back is going to go into extension. But everything in between is also good. It's just we don't fix it, and we just don't stay in that posture for, you know, huge amounts of time.
I'm wondering, this is a bit clickbaity of me, sorry, internet, but I've got to do it. You mentioned training aids, and now you're mentioning fixing horses in one position. Could we have your 2 pennies worth, rehab lady, on training aids, please?
I've walked myself into this deep hole.
You did.
Okay, so I'm not 100% anti-training aids. I think used in the right way with skilled handlers, and used ethically, so they're not using force that the horse can't ever escape from, I think they can be useful in certain circumstances. However, with the right training and the right time, you can achieve what a training aid is trying to achieve without using one. I think the literature doesn't really support the use of them as much as we think it should do. One of the papers that actually is co-authored by a colleague of mine at Hartbury, she published quite a long time ago, must have been about 15 years ago now, was on the Pessoa training aid, and it showed that horses actually shortened their stride. They reduced the extension in the lumbosacral region, which is something that, you know, we want to try and achieve. We want to try and achieve that sort of tuck of the hind limbs. It also showed that the horses moved vertically up and down more, so it appeared to show that it had the right effects. It was a small sample size, and actually all the horses that were used in that study were quite well established dressage horses, and they had, and I'm going to use this term again, the capacity to respond to the training aid in the way that it was designed to respond. But if you put that same training aid on a horse that's come out of race training, it's not going to have that same effect. So I think there are better ways in doing things than just slapping a training aid on and expecting it to do 20 minutes on the lunge.
Thank you. I think it's important to show the balance and have that conversation, and it's so helpful to hear you citing studies that actually have looked at this and the relevance of those. And science is so, although yes, science can give us answers, like you're saying, that study was conducted on dressage horses that were able to give the right response to the training aid. But if it was done on a group of 10 racehorses, you would see their compensation patterns. You would see maybe changes in gait, changes in tight tension, all of it. It's just, mate, Gillian, you're very wonderful teacher. I'm so grateful for you giving us your time this evening, because my goodness, what an oracle of a fount of knowledge you are. So, Gillian, we have a closing tradition on this podcast. Gillian is terrified now because she maybe hasn't heard me ask this question before. It's really not that scary. And you may have already said the answer, but I asked the same question, and it's really interesting to hear all the different answers that we've received. A lot of them actually follow a similar track, but I'm interested to hear your response. If you had one thing that you could say to every equestrian, and they had to listen, I've changed it a bit, like they had to do the thing that you are suggesting, what would you say?
I think I would ask the owner to treat their horse as an individual. I think we have to adapt everything that we do for the horse in front of us, and it's not simple. There's no magic one answer either. And the good thing about being a scientist, which I think hopefully I can call myself a scientist, is that you learn through the scientific method that you spend your entire life disproving theories to get closer and closer to the end goal, but you will never reach that end goal because there's always more questions. So for everybody out there with a horse trying to work out what to do with them, just look at them, assess them, take advice, but look at them as an individual and enjoy it. It's hard enough to look after these horses. So as you go through this process, just make sure you take some time to enjoy being with your horse as well.
Lovely. Gillian, how lucky your Hartpury students are, truly. I know that you have obviously your own business and presence on the internet. That makes me sound about 70. We will add all of your links to your various locations in the show notes so people can find you. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And you've asked some brilliant questions. I feel like I could have spoken for hours and hours. It's so great also to speak to like-minded guys that are trying to do the best for your own horses as well as sharing that information. And thank you for inviting me to talk.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this podcast. We will, of course, put all of Gillian's information in the show notes below. We will see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.